welcome. Welcome to Sense Space. Welcome, Daniel. Great to have you here.
Good to be here.
It's been, it's been a few years. I've had in mind a conversation with you, your Emerge podcast project, which is just now drawing to a close, almost ironically. Um, but, out of that closure, also the opening of your new substack, Intimate Mirror. Is that right? Intimate Mirror?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've been on quite a whirlwind of a journey in recent months. I know the last years and months have been a whirlwind for me too. And I definitely sense the awakening of the sacred in your experience in new ways coming through. So feels like, I guess it's happening at exactly the right time that it was supposed to. And you're super welcome in Sense Space, and you've been a part of the broader field of this podcast, over its 4 years of existence. So glad to have you here, and maybe just where feels right for you to start this conversation. I mean, I'd be happy to just start with what's been alive in your journey in the last few months.
Yeah, we can start there. I think maybe what's top of heart and mind is just appreciating you. I feel warmly welcomed, and I really appreciate the invitation for the supportive intelligences that wasn't part of the recording, but was a part of our you brought in, and happy to be here with you.
Yeah, that sort of invocation has become more and more a part of my practice. I was always doing this kind of, space making. I called it dropping in and leading a meditation. We did silent today, but leading people in, first body, and then into the space, into an awareness of this kind of shared field. And at a certain point in 2021, I had a really, really deep 5-gram mushroom journey, during which I kind of found myself, in this kind of cosmic basin, this very spacious, almost like floating in space. And I reflected whilst I was sort of up there in the atmosphere, on my little life, down in the flat in Berlin, and this podcast Sense Space. And I realized that thing that my little life is trying to point towards with this podcast is this bigger space. And it just became really clear that is kind of that's available at the edges of every conversation. And Matthew Green, my kind of co-creator for the Resonant Man, has been really good also with the invocations. Yesterday we did a first session for a month on ancestry. And he really brings a lot of respect for what it means to open that field. And it's very similar to in the kind of spiritual warfare space. Like if you're opening a liminal space, be very clear about what you're inviting in. So
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a huge part of leadership. I was trained in authentic relating, circling. Do you know circling?
Vicariously, yeah.
Yeah, and so they're a big part of that training is the form of leadership that is setting context. And for me, I think as it seems to be for you, it's all about setting up the enabling conditions of the space. And I really appreciate and honor the way you did that. Felt very good. And so I'm happy to go anywhere you want to go. I would love for you to lead us.
Cool. All right. This is nice. It's nice to do this with a veteran dialoguer and podcaster, because I feel there's a little sort of field of we're in the live podcast zone, and it can kind of come in as this,
Totally.
almost artificial vibe.
Yeah, it does change the vibe. I mean, this is the first podcast that I've done in like 7 or 8 months, I think. First recorded conversation. Yeah. So I definitely feel
mm,
a little bit like, but I love the way that you're holding the space. It makes me feel safe and at ease.
it's yeah. Well, I'm glad to hear that, and it's definitely for me like there is a changing relationship to it
Mm.
that has come, and like I can remember in the earlier years there was more of a sense of like we're on, and like I'm in the
Yeah.
on mode now,
Yeah.
you know, and there's almost
Yeah,
like this
totally.
switch up in energy, like welcome to the show kind of thing. Um, and you know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's all well and good, but the kind of vibe that I've been trying to transmit in the space that I'm trying to create, in these podcasts and then with the Sense Based Studio and the live events now is like I want to create the conditions for people to really be themselves
Mm.
and also to be receptive to a transformative experience to occur, basically. Um, like that for me is the conditions in which, you know, a kind of medicine or, you
Yes.
know, a field of wisdom can begin to act on a group of people. And that's really what it's all about for me is creating that more more frequently. And maybe one more piece to add is that one of the most beautiful realizations that's been dawning for me out of this kind of notion of fields is that you can almost get that thing. It has a life of its own, and so if you tend to it in the right way and you invoke and you build and you tend and you show up for it, eventually the field just becomes intoned with the energy, and you don't
Mm.
even need to like do anything at all. You just show up in that field and it's working on you.
Well said. Yeah. Mm.
So where are you in the world? Because so much of my sense of your background story was just you hanging out at monastic academy and then you left and then I
Yeah.
just didn't I didn't really track what happened after that.
Yeah, man. I was, yeah, I was at Maple for about 6 years non-continuously. And this is like for those who don't know, yeah, kind of monastic, like contemplative training community in northern Vermont, and left, I want to say 18 months ago, but I'm not very good at time. Something like that. And now I'm been in Asheville. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, where I've been for about the last year or so. Yeah.
Well, and how is that for you?
Yeah, I love it. I live in a little community with five other people, all of whom, like many of whom we met through the monastic academy. We're all like in the kind of spiritual transformational world. Many of us are practitioners of Aletheia unfolding, which is the methodology of coaching and transformational practice that I mostly make a living through. We have dinner together 6 nights a week. Um, it's great. Yeah, I feel very happy here.
It sounds like a very nice level of co-regulation
It
is what
is,
I'm
it was,
hearing.
it's nice. I mean, definitely when we first all got together, we were all like recovering from the structure of Maple. So we were just like, we're not going to agree to anything, like no schedule, nothing. We're kind of, yeah, wanting to uh, experience what unstructured space was like after years of getting up at 4 a.m. and needing to be everywhere on time. But yeah, I think it's a nice balance. It's a good, beautiful community.
Mm. And I know you're now sort of co-located with, I know Jordan Hall moved out there
Hmm.
and some of this Schmachtenberger gang. Are you guys
Hmm.
kind of mixing it up out there yet? Or
Yeah, there's a little like meta modern liminal hub forming here in Asheville for sure. Yeah, and it's drawing in other people that are moving here, and yeah, something's happening. in
Mm.
Asheville area.
I think there's almost what like when I sense into the metaphysical shift in what you're transmitting, it feels
Mhm.
like well, it feels like you're discovering God. Um, and I want to um,
Mm.
I want to approach with like humility and respect the more sort of Buddhist work and journey you've been on at monastic academy, whilst also bringing in my own experience of that side of things, which is that there's seemed to be a kind of focus on emptiness um, more than fullness.
Mm.
And certainly for me, I observed in later years. I mean, meditation was incredible for me, and it unlocked so much in my early journey. But it
Mm.
also became 100% like a traumatic coping mechanism.
Totally.
And I visited, well, I'm just going to be honest, all love to Maple and everybody I met there, but I actually went to Vermont for a retreat with my friend Kim and a community in Brattleboro. Beautiful private piece of land, and it was very kind of like a self-organizing retreat kind of thing. Like people brought different practices, conscious cannabis ceremony, dancing,
Yeah.
and like yeah, it was more of a plant medicine kind of space, and I had a huge openings there, and it also connected with some wonderful people from Maple who came down for that, including Sky. But then when I went up, it was like such a radical
Yeah.
flip that I actually felt like it felt like I had entered into like a family home where there was like this trauma in the background, but nobody was naming it. And it just, everybody was like eating their food really like
Mm.
quietly and like overly consciously in a way. And it just felt like it was very actually triggering
Mm.
in a way for me. And I ended up sort of like rejecting the experience and like having Sky come and be like, "Yeah, you're gonna get up at this time," and I was like, "Well, is there a choice in this? Like, is what happened to consent when I entered this environment?" And all this stuff came up for me,
Yeah.
and yeah, I mean, my turning has been really my path has been much more at the integration of what's come for me through plant medicine.
Mm.
Um, what's come for me through integration of Christianity
Mm.
and sort of the meeting of those as like the Christian
Mm.
father maybe and then the plant medicine mother, um,
Mm. Beautiful.
all of which I've really tried to really sort of find in the world and find through the direct unfoldment of my own experience and you know the signs and the pieces as I piece them together along the way.
Gorgeous. Yeah. Well, yeah, a couple things. One is I agree with you. I think most people seem to practice meditation from a posture of a traumatized endeavor to fix themselves, we might say. And for me now, when I work with people, the very first thing that I will typically work with them on is to clarify their fundamental motivation, that this path is embarked on out of a love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake. That if we're doing it out of an endeavor to fix ourselves, we're just getting it wrong, and life cannot unfold from there. Um, and I certainly did that, and I think many people at Maple did. I have critiques of the kind of the pedagogy at Maple, but I also could defend it, like what you just said. I think there's a way that I believe Soryu, the founder and teacher there, and he learned this from Japanese Zen, was endeavoring to create a kind of environment that if it would reveal the ways in which you are still fixed, right? So it's not meant to be comfortable. It's not meant to be safe. It's not meant to be amenable to our conditioning. It's supposed to challenge us and poke us and prod us and show us exactly where we're still holding on. And that's a great gift in this world when so
Mm.
much of everywhere is just trying to keep their hands off us and make sure that we don't get upset and, all that. So, but it's not
Uh-huh,
for
uh-huh.
everybody. There's many paths. What you're doing sounds beautiful. And again, I can, I can, I don't think we want to have this conversation, but we could spend 2 hours and I could, in very fine detail, critique Maple. We could have another conversation that was equally long, and I could tell you how incredible Maple is, how beautiful it is, what a special, unique place it is. So I'm so grateful for it.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, well, I'm glad I could bring that very brief, just like flash, like painting image I had of my like 3 or 4 days there, and
Yeah, it's a common experience.
um,
I was always reluctant to like invite friends to Maple. I'd be like, you may or may not have a good time.
yeah. Oh, I guess what I hear in that with respect to Soryu and this approach is a kind of masculine monastic structure
Very much. Yeah.
and the value of surrendering yourself uh, unto a tradition, unto something that's already established, and trusting that it sort of knows better than you, in some
Exactly.
sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm. And that's such a, like, I think we touched on this a little earlier, but it feels like our cultural moment is maybe one in which the majority of aversion is towards that kind of religious structure. It's also where a lot of it's a combo of like aversion and trauma. And I'm thinking particularly now of people who grow up Christian or Catholic or anything like that, that sense of a sort of disciplinary routine that
Mm.
ultimately, when you end up getting out of it in your teens, feels arbitrary. And it's almost like having that masculine structure without having the underlying like feminine truth within it really being there, and that really kind of that fucks people up, and it sends them right out on a side path if they have a masculine structure imposed or composed upon them by people who themselves don't seem to actually have a connection to the source energy of what it's about. And that's
Yeah.
basically the condition of most people who've grown up in Christianity today or even encountered it in others.
Yeah. Amen. I think a lot of the kind of postmodern chaos is downstream from prior failures of healthy, fatherly, masculine structuring. And that failure is exactly what you say. It's structure that is not for the sake of the robust emergence of life, but instead for reasons and you know uh, just self-justifying or selfishness or power for its own sake. I mean, when I got to Maple, and I've reflected on this, like I had never previously found myself in any structure, including, unfortunately, and with all love for my father, my family system. Never been in a structure and system in which I fully trusted the authority. And I think I was right to do so. In no structure that I had been in, public education, college, jobs, was the like authority actually in deep fidelity with reality and like the truth of love and the support of life and its emergence in and through me. Like that never, I had never experienced that. And so my relationship to authority was pretty wonky. And that's part of the reason why I think Soryu gets, part of the reason, not the whole reason, part of the reason Soryu gets so much projectiled at him is, yeah, there's a lot of confusion about legitimate authority in our culture.
Mm. Yeah, I'd like to dig into that a little more, but first just expressing my resonance with the sense of um I don't want to say that I haven't. I've had definitely I've had male figures who were loving in various respects, but it's never felt like, you know, I grew up with a field of where there were men who were like embodying this sort of like primordial manhood, you know, where there's just like a suchness and an isness to it that is in right
Yeah.
relation with
Oh,
reality, and it feels whole. It's much more this kind of ancestral trauma kind of landmine minefield
totally.
that we've come up in,
Yeah.
and that's been
Yeah.
also a big piece of my journey with respect to understanding, you know, what how significant was the impact of these wars
Mm,
in recent generations, and how does that live in us, and
yeah.
um, well,
100%.
I think we're still piecing that together, and there's still a huge sort of vacuum of understanding around that. Like we seem to have clocked the tyrannical male, or the shadow masculine is in the spotlight,
Mm,
but the actual deep embodied understanding of the collective trauma around that is not there.
yeah. Yeah.
And actually, for it to be there, you almost need men themselves leading from that place. And equally, the shadow feminine is not really perceived and is able to kind of move more readily, I would say, because the spotlight is so on the shadow masculine, you
Mhm.
know, within ourselves and culture.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, there's probably an important distinction here to be made. Like much of what, certainly I'll say, speak for myself, like much of what I would identify as like, quote, toxic masculinity in my own psyche was rooted in failures of love and trauma, some of which were inherited through ancestral, generational experiences of war and things like that. But that the expression of like subclinical narcissistic tendencies, things that hurt people in love, uh, those were had the roots in pain. And I think it's really important to see that. And it's important to see that there are also like psychopaths. And we
Mm.
should differentiate between like, you know, normal, like traumatized masculinity and like people who we should create strong boundaries around to protect communities that are trying to organize according to love and all that.
Yeah, it's a subtle, it's a deep, subtle dance, and it's actually an unfolding question for me of how to do that.
Me too.
Uh, like with respect, particularly to the what is called the narcissistic male.
Mm,
Like I see a lot of people in my field who are in reaction to the narcissistic male, whether it's their father or husband or whoever else. Um, and there's a complete ignorance to the reality that all narcissism is wounded narcissism. So I'm always trying to like bring
mhm.
that forward. Like, no, you can't say narcissist
Yes.
without wounded. Like those are the same. Those are inseparable.
Yes.
Um,
And it often also occludes the narcissism of the person who's pointing the finger. I think A.H. Almaas, I don't know if you're familiar with the teachings of A.H. Almaas. He has this
not very
wonderful book
much.
called The Point of Existence. He's a great teacher, and he basically makes a very persuasive case that um, any lack of contact with your the truth of your being, your essence, necessarily creates narcissistic compensations. And so almost everybody is walking around with some form of like narcissistic identity structure. Now we would differentiate between like pathological narcissism. There's all kinds of spectrums, but like here we are, you know, in this world that tends to create selves that are disconnected from deep essence. And we should have, I think, a lot of compassion for that, a lot of care for each other.
What does yeah, what does it mean for you to become more connected with essence?
Um, Yeah, the way that I like to frame it is that the path is a process of the clarification of desire. And so, for the people I work with, we often look at, and this is a frame that I've received from Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney and David J. Temple, their work with cosmorotic humanism. But
Mm.
we look at what you want and why you want it. And often this will disclose itself through the suffering of your life. And we will strip back the layers of parts-based compensations to find that, over a period of time, that what you most deeply want is what you are. And that then, you know, clarifies things immensely.
That's wonderful news.
Yes, it is. It is. It is the
That
good
sounds
news.
like the good news. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I felt good just hearing that. So that's wonderful, you know? Yeah. I mean, I can kind of track that. Like, I like to think that m many of my desires are fairly virtuous at this point in life, but it's easy to like there's a subtlety in this. Like, um, I want to reach a place of confidence with my rap music. Like, I've been doing it for a few years. I've produced some good stuff. Performance is very early stages, and there's a desire to be able to go out and be in a park or whatever, and
Hell yeah.
or on an open mic, and to
Cool.
do my thing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there's a degree of ego confidence.
Mm.
There's kind of an ego consolidation in a way. It feels like in order to be able to go out and give your thing, or like a groundedness in it initially. Um, but on the other hand, I can see that like the desire behind it is to get to a place where it's just like, ultimately just flowing,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
then to be seen for flowing from my essence. And
Yeah.
then it's
Yeah.
like, well, I don't need to impress or
Yeah.
do things to get the lady's attention. It's just gonna be,
Yeah. It's B. Yeah.
but in order to get there, there's like this,
Well, exactly. And that's actually, I think, core to the path essentially is like, with whatever clarity you have, you go forth and you try to make it happen, embody it. And then you hit up against suffering, which is exactly where you are deluded. And then you clarify, and then you come back out and you try,
mhm, mhm.
and then you hit up against your suffering. It's that iterative loop, but it demands that you follow the clearest desire you have, the clearest soul longing that you have. Otherwise, you can get trapped in these cul-de-sacs that probably most people in our culture are there, where they're just totally beholden to the manipulations of Moloch and don't know what they're doing and don't know what they want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's a lot of fear um,
Mm.
around, especially if you're in a big city in a northern country. There's just a lot of fear in the air, and I feel that so lucidly when I go back to London and see friends who went into finance and things like that. Like, it's just sort of in the background, and
Yeah.
stress and climbing the ladder. But there's an absolute impoverishment of psychological and spiritual development in that
Yeah.
in that cultural space. Um,
Mm. It's really tragic. Yeah.
but I love that model. That model feels really pertinent because I like to think that I've worked with this idea of the soul's curriculum,
Hmm.
and that both in respect to those sort of true desires, and also the people and circumstances that we magnetize and come
Yes.
around, and like reading that not from a perspective of random, but from a perspective of
Yes.
Okay, there's intelligence behind all of this. Even if I
Yes.
appear to be magnetizing like some relational dynamic that is a repetition of something in the
Exactly.
past, well, maybe there's a way in which it's presenting again so that I can like look at it and understand it and
Yeah.
experience it more fully, and that in somehow moving in alignment with desire, I'm also actually perhaps more likely to come into contact with the things that surface, the kind of stories of lack or isolation, alienation. And it's something I've kind of clocked in relation to other friends who were kind of on this path, is that there seems to be this way in which, like, when you get into your sacred flow, like you're really on your path, like there's a deep clarification of where you are and why you're here and what you're doing. Oftentimes people will get that. They'll have like a 3 day streak and then it will just like, it almost like my
Yeah.
friend Matthew describes it as like getting the plumbing working in an old house. Like it just like breaks off the
Yeah.
debris and
Totally.
suddenly it's like my story of like, oh,
Mm.
I'm this or that is coming up.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's
It's
again
amazing
and
how it
again and
works.
again.
Yeah.
And so just like, I mean, a few days ago, I was saying to my friend, like, "Oh, I feel like I've signed, I like implicitly signed up somewhere for an accelerated healing program."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's my experience too, is you clarified your desire, you receive vision, you completely give yourself to it, and then you get broken. You just get shattered because you do your best and your full sincerity, and then you know, it's what it is. You directly see all the ways you're still holding on, all the ways that you're, yeah, that's breaks you, breaks me, breaks me. It
Mm.
has over and over and over again. Um, and also, it's interesting, I think, to throw back to the earlier part of our conversation. A lot of what keeps people from entering this kind of iterative journey is the sense that this cosmos is chaos, right? Which is a kind of failure of exactly that kind of divine fatherly ordering, right? That there's a sense that we do not live in an ordered, meaningful, intelligent reality, but instead it's just like, I don't know, matter bumping up against each other or something, and I gotta get what's mine and protect what I have, and I don't know. It doesn't really matter what I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost, I think there is a sense that there's an order, but the order lies almost ultimately in those man-made systems. Like the order is,
Mm. Hmm.
I go to university, I do the right thing, I get the right
Yeah, right,
job,
right, right.
I get the house, I get the mortgage.
Hmm.
That's the order that is
Yeah,
like, that's the more fundamental order, rather
fragile.
than
Yeah,
there's this much deeper, more
that's a
complex
good way of putting
cosmic
it. Yeah, well
order
said.
underlying all of those structures
Yep,
and weaving in and out of them.
yep. Yeah, although even that, what you just said, for many people, especially younger people, I think is falling apart. Like even the
The
belief in
first or the
that
second?
story. Yeah, like, oh, I can go to college, get a
Uh,
house, and then I'll be happy. It's like hard to sustain that story when, the world is like on fire in seven different ways. Yeah.
I think that's precisely where we are. And yeah, I would identify with being in that generation
Mm. How old are you?
for sure. I'm 28.
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah,
So
I'm almost 10 years older than you. Okay. Nice.
my
Yeah.
college, the perceived value of my college degrees, I did a bachelor's in history and then I did a master's in terrorism, security, and society.
Mm.
And they both perceivably plummeted within like 6 months of
Yeah,
graduating.
man.
And
I
then it was
mean,
like, oh, none of
totally.
this actually led to where I thought it was going to lead. and I've enrolled for a like 40-year long increased tax scheme called student
Oh,
loan,
oh,
sort of graduate
brutal.
tax. And yeah, it means very little to me. The most valuable things that came out of university was, the fact that I went on exchange to California and tripped LSD for the first time when I was 19, and the relationships that I had
Mm,
outside of class and things like that. So,
mm,
but there's
hmm,
there's a posture of trust for me, like that has to live even more deeply than the sort of fear matrix that both being in those structures and feeling those structures are not working can bring about.
mm.
I've had to
Yes.
work through those in order to like sort of authentically participate within them.
Mm.
Like, yeah,
In a sense.
I am gonna pay my student loan taxes, and I don't know how I'm going to gain property assets and move out of renting.
Mm,
But
mm,
I do actually trust in God, and I trust in what I'm doing. And there's a lot of people in the spiritual marketplace offering kind of versions of the answer to this of like
mm,
follow your bliss and
mm.
make $100,000 and clients, the kind of coaching stuff.
For
But
sure.
there's a kind of deeper basin of trust that I've
Mm,
found um, underneath all of that, which is not
mm,
so specifically contingent on making it rich,
mm,
but it is about sort of laying up my riches in the kingdom of heaven and feeling like
mm,
more in
mhm.
what
Yes.
Patrick Connor calls living in the field of miracles and
Beautiful. Yeah.
living in the
Beautiful
wow.
pictures.
Um,
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
and there
Yeah.
is a way that does just it translates to connection and it translates to a felt sense of value.
Yes.
And thank God those things still mean something in the world.
Exactly.
And so, you can be supported and you can create a way of working and moving slowly, 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 oftentimes whilst being one foot in the structure that is and one foot out and trying to like poco a poco kind of build
Yeah.
that up.
Yeah. 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 Beautifully said. Exactly. Yeah. I see it the same way. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
I feel that I'm sort of leading on the questions thus far in the dialogue, and I want to sort of invite more of
Hmm.
your inner compass, your curiosity.
Hmm. No, I was just feeling into the space after you finished that. I just noticed I feel a lot of resonance. Like, um, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Um, it's not clear where to go. I think there's a part of me that wants to like, I often find myself in the position in the work that I do of lovingly pushing people to leap. And I think the conversation we're having right now is often the kind of conversation that I'll have with them where it's like, look, the thing that you think is safe and secure is not. It is not. True safety and true security is somewhere else. And but it's not where you think it is. You need to move in a new direction. Right. And even like last week in the US, Trump and Elon Musk basically like blew up the lives of tons of career government officials who are just going to be like, don't have all other skills, have brownstones in DC, And it's just like, oops. And it's tragic, actually, of families, but the world we're moving into is not one where the stories that people align themselves with for a relatively impoverished sense of security and safety will any longer be even remotely trustworthy and dependable. And I think the younger you are, the more obvious that is. Like the closer our bodies are to that truth, I think the younger we are. Um, but that's one of my hopes with like media, like podcasts and stuff, is that you can kind of, push people into a position where they're willing to take a leap, because ultimately you have to change your life. You can't just listen to people talk about it.
I'm struck in this moment that that leap is kind of it's like it's a fractal leap
Mm.
in the sense that um, by measure of um, many of my friends from past lives, I've taken a lot of leaps.
Mm.
I've possibly, for many people's view, made the leap. You know, I've upended myself. I lived out of a bag for 18 months to 2 years, lived in the uncertainty, found a place that eventually I was called to be, am creating my own universe from my passions. And yet, from my perspective, I feel like I'm still in the lead up to making the leap almost because
Indeed.
I'm still like, you know, it's probably 80% of my income still comes from a job that is completely
Mm.
unrelated to,
Mm.
or largely unrelated to any of this. And the little piece that's slowly growing of like building in such a way that I can actually live meaningfully from doing what is like deeply aligned for me is like it's a slow grower.
Yeah.
Um, and the leaping is for me not necessarily a sense of like recklessly sabotaging my financial security in that way.
No.
It's
Yes.
more like how do I continuously keep that or like orienting towards that
Yeah.
and more deeply like how do I make that leap when I've stepped out into the world and that like stuff is coming up, like that story's coming up, or I'm feeling like, oh, I'm feeling socially excluded right now, or I'm not
Right.
belonging, or
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that. How do I kind of sort of have such an honored and sustained relationship with the sacred and with the wow and with
Yeah.
the sort of medicine space as like moving into the place of like healing and receptivity to like the benevolence of the loving mother in reality that I can like actually almost alchemize that in real time. Like, yes, it's here. Yes, I'm loving it. You know,
Yeah, man. I mean,
like living in prayer it would be another way of
exactly.
describing what I'm talking
Oh,
about.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, you probably, I should say, and um, I think so, you're right, exactly right. When I say, if I say like you ought to leap, as Allah, as they say, it's like trust in Allah and tie up your camel. It's like don't be stupid,
Uh-huh.
right? like take care of what needs to be taken care of. Of course, don't be dumb, but leap. And it's not like you leap once and then it's over. The life of prayer is to ongoingly leap. You leap, you leap, you leap, you leap, you leap. You just keep leaping. That's what it's like. You just get it gets easier. I don't think it's easier. You just trust and trust and trust so that you can leap and leap and leap.
I'm wondering if there's like what's your sense of the teleology and the directionality, if there is one for you, of that process, of the unfoldment of that process of the leaping?
Yeah, well, as I wrote about it on my Substack, and it sounds like you read the longer series, the 6-part
Mm.
series. It's like I think I completed some kind of major cycle of like where the leaping was mostly interior, like leaping into it really felt like there was something that had to be resolved in my interiority. Um, and it doesn't feel like that anymore, which is really relieving. Um, and my leaping now seems to be much more externalized, like it has to do with the projects and relationships that I'm involved with. Yeah.
Mm. I resonate a lot with the that then that kind of
Mm. Mm.
directionality of your experience there. Like,
Mm.
I definitely feel like it's been a hell of a lot of internal leaping in my inner world, in my metaphysics, in my relationship to God, and in processes of personal and collective healing. Learning to let the initiatory intelligence move through me, and sort of
Yes.
getting a grip on what that is and what that feels like, and knowing like, ah, this is a time to let that thing do its thing.
Totally. And just because I can imagine somebody might be listening and have a certain kind of idea of what I just said. I'm not saying I'm done. Okay. Just let's be clear. Just this morning, I was doing deep emotional processing and trying to figure out what I was avoiding. But I do feel like I've passed a certain threshold of like fundamental safety. Um, and therefore, the release of certain shame dynamics that have previously conditioned my life and behavior. That's all. So I'm not saying that I'm done. I don't want those projections.
Yeah. And well, in my experience, often people sort of teach best from the thing that they themselves are most
Mm,
grappling with.
mm,
Um, and I've definitely been guilty of being able to convey wisdoms to people that I myself am still in the process
mm.
of like really reckoning with. Um,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
and there is a doneness, though. There is a doneness there that I can sense, which is like to reach a place where
Mm,
like love for the divine and love as the divine, like it's evident to you that that is actually the foundational truth of reality.
yeah.
When death, when you kind of sense that death is ultimately leading on to that or through that,
Yes.
that's huge. That's
It's a big
really
deal.
huge. It's a huge deal. And it's very enabling of then being able to
Leap.
confront what can seem like such like massive, like, oh,
Yeah,
like I've never even
exactly.
seen outside of this thing that
Exactly.
I'm wrapped up in since
Yeah.
childhood or ancestral. Um,
Right.
but it doesn't in a in a Christological context for me, it's like even if I truly sense, the light of the ever beyond is ultimately what's beyond
Mm,
this,
mm.
that doesn't equate to I have realized the degree of courage to be crucified.
Yeah.
in and
100%.
sometimes I have these moments of just like especially since ayahuasca, I have these weird moments of like sort of absolute subjectivity where I'm like, what
Mm,
am I actually
mm,
in? And if I actually like follow through continuously with that sort of sacred impulse,
mm,
what situation is it going to put me in? And is it going to
mm,
put me in a situation where I have to die
mm.
or suffer something horrible in order to do
Yes.
that? And that's an open question for me, Daniel. Like,
Mm,
has I mean, the Christian tradition says that's kind of been done
mm,
now, and simply by like deeply connecting with and honoring the truth of that being done by earlier generations,
mm.
we don't have to have our fingernails torn
We'll
off in
see.
order to
We'll see. Right. I
but
mean, so for me, it's like the shift is, am I willing to do anything for the sake of love? Right. Is the motivational system rebalanced such that love is the primary mover? And if that's the case, like doing anything for love, I mean, this is true in the Buddhist system too, there's, yeah, that actually means being willing to do anything, but you don't know. That's why there's faith. We just have faith and we love. But you can't have conditions on that.
no, no. But I am wrestling with it,
Oh
and
yeah, totally.
it's
Totally. Yeah,
it's
of course.
coming.
Yeah, of course. That's how
Yeah.
our faith, that's how our faith gets strengthened, right? Is through wrestling. Yeah.
Like the two poles of my sort of dream landscape over the
Mm,
last year, I would say, or years, is like, wow, like I'm having such confounding mystical dreams, and wisdom teachers that I'm aware of in real life are coming in my dreams and like
mm,
conveying these deep transmissions to me.
mm,
And it almost feels like this kind of like energy field work is like just being done through my sleep. And then there's this other pole of it, which is like have I had a crucifixion dream 2 years ago that
mm,
really, really just like took a long time to process. And also, I've been reading a lot about Native American um, culture with respect to warfare and how they would treat enemies, and just the
mm.
degree of brutality is something that
Right.
my system is just like really struggling to process, because I ultimately come from this place of like, I want to understand me as the perpetrator of, and the victim of. And that for me is like what holistic
Yeah.
healing looks like. So,
Yeah. I have a model that I like here, which is like, um, if you imagine a spectrum, on one side there's saints, and on the other side there's like psychopaths. Um, a saint is fully devoted to living in alignment with the love of goodness, truth, and beauty for its own sake, such that even in a context of, say, torture, they remain completely aligned with that motivation. A psychopath is aligned with the motivation of manipulation, even in the conditions where they're surrounded by loving community. They will nonetheless stick to their manipulative ways. And so, I want to be more saintly. If I were being tortured, I would probably lose my. I would guess. I predict I would lose my center. Hopefully, I'll never have to find that out. But I want to become the kind of person who wouldn't.
hmm. Yeah, just reopening the whole conversational field in this moment to like
Mm.
what else is here, potentially also with a sort of future orientation.
Hmm.
I'm still sensing there's more in relation to this. I don't know whether you've been doing this explicitly or not, but what I sense to be sort of invocation of the Great Mother and invocation
Mm.
of an underlying healing intelligence in reality. And this is obviously something that's still so at the edges of, certainly at the edges of mainstream culture, but even at some like, you know, more wisdom oriented spaces, it's right out there at the edge. Even within Christianity,
Mm.
it's it's a sort of
Yes.
it's such a beautiful and simple thing in a way, but it's so at the fringe to reach the place of receptivity to that
Yes.
individually. And I can't imagine I would have found my way to it were it not for powerful sort of encounters with the feminine through plant medicine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
And,
I can
yeah,
see like having worked with that and experienced that, part of it for me is to know like how to bring that through and to start to create space where,
exactly.
all right, we're having a conversation, but this guy's got the healing impulse to just like be in full body shakes right now, and that's
Hmm.
like completely okay, you know,
Exactly.
and we can sort of bear witness at that level as well. So I'm wondering how you kind of see the insight in your writing, like actually being able to sort of land relationally
Sure.
and culturally.
Yeah. Let me see how I want to respond to this. So, hmm. Yeah, I would say, so I hosted this podcast, the Emerge podcast, which maybe we mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation. And I spoke to all these like very beautiful people, thinkers, philosophers, practitioners, teachers, with an eye towards like, I was like 25 or something. I was like, what is going on? Like, what do I do? It seems very confusing. This world seems very confusing. And it also seems like we're not doing it right. Like, we're not being together in a way that is meaningfully responding to the depth and pervasiveness of the problems that we're facing. Like, it takes work to even recognize the problems, a lot of work, actually. And the kind of overlapping consensus that I both received from the people I spoke with and started to develop in myself is that the metacrisis is best understood as a kind of failure of intimacy, and the response is one that will look something like a religious response. Specifically, as you say, the invocation, the evocation, the recentering of value of sacred world at the center of what generates culture. And to get people there, to even like set up the prior justification so that people can see that clearly takes a lot of work because people are very, very confused right now. And so what I'm trying to do with my writing is like figure out a way to like
Mm.
push, inspire, invite people to see that. Because then once we see that, we can start collaborating and we can build things and take over infrastructure and change culture. And we need to do it very quickly, actually. But the good news is that reality, value, sacred world organizes us much better than delusion organizes the people that are currently in power. And so if we can get enough people who actually can see this clearly and are operating according to reality, I have a lot of faith that we can pull a rabbit out of a hat. But, you know, there's not much time and we should get to it.
Amen. Yeah, let's get
Yeah.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something of a partnering with divine possibility that
Exactly.
I resonate with in that, which is
Yes.
like, you know, you sort of posture yourself humbly in line with this, and you don't like kind of like get wrapped up in like how's it going to grow into this thing that I egotistically desire it to grow into, or what have you, and you just kind of stay with like, how do I tend the
Mhm.
sacredness in it now?
Exactly.
Then it does seem to be able to grow sort of by itself. And then it's like, oh, there's all these people that I didn't know about
Hmm.
that are already like tapped in.
That's right.
And a good number of those people, it's almost like there's a different, might be the wrong word to use, but there's like a different hierarchy. There's like a parallel hierarchy
Hmm.
in love of wisdom and tapped inness to the sacred,
There
that,
is.
and then there's the hierarchy of society as such, and then there's people in various rungs of society who,
Yes.
because of the unfoldment of their own lives in relation to the kind of collapse unfoldment of the collective psychological situation, are like breaking open, cracking open, drawn to the sacred attractor. And then when they come into that space, it's like things can kind of happen differently.
Mm.
Like this is something that's become very apparent through my kind of collaborator Matthew, who's very involved with the Thomas Hubel
Mm. Cool. Yeah.
field. And he described just this principle to me the other night. Like there's all these people who are sort of, high level players, so to speak, like they're working at a higher level in the structures of society. But then,
Mm.
like within the sangha of that work, there's just a kind of, it's operating on a different
They're low rank.
frequency
Yeah.
and resonance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Equal. There's kind of
Uh-huh.
an,
Oh,
yeah.
interesting. Okay. Well.
Well, it's just like that as you bet, they're all just students of Thomas. Like it's not
Oh, I see. There's
necessarily
not.
like,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah. But it can also be, there can be that sense of like
Yeah. Well,
differentials.
I was in speaking with, I don't know if you know the work of John Churchill. He's created this thing called the
No,
planetary
often.
Dharma.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing that he's created. And in conversation with him, he said, this paraphrasing, but this building of uh, organizational power within the context of sacred world is rooted in right relationship, and it's rooted in the willingness to know your rank. Meaning that, as you say, there are differentials. Some people are more surrendered, more wise, more tapped in, however you want to frame it, and we should listen to them. And so this is again is where the father wound, the failure of masculine organizing, gets triggered. So when I say that, know your rank, people might, even who are listening, might freak out and be like, "Well, that's not spiritual. That's not okay." But that's how nature organizes according to natural hierarchies. In this case, wisdom hierarchies. That is how we should probably organize our world. I would like the most wise people to be creating the systems and structures and making the choices. That seems like a good idea.
Mm. Yeah, I just cracked open. I can't remember the exact title, like Socrates at the Limits of Education. It's one that
Mm.
Viveki recommends, and
Mm.
been revelatory for me, having been in Dialogo space for so long, to actually start to get closer to the root texts and that whole model um, in the Republic, in which there's this whole extensive training program, and the class that kind of reaches the highest echelon of that is the one that trains in dialectic.
Mm.
Like dialectic happens at age 30 to 35 after you've done mathematic, which obviously includes a lot more, and the physical training and
Yes.
so on. But that sense of like the philosopher king energy being sort of like Oh, yeah,
Yes.
maybe that should be at least at the level of ideal
Yeah, but again,
presented
no
as the
people
top.
have never most people have never experienced anything even remotely close to that. Like before I was at Maple, I was super fascinated with like flat, non-hierarchical organizational designs. I was at Occupy Wall Street for 8 months. That was like my jam. I love that stuff. I've never seen a more functional organization than the one that Soryu was leading because he could just say what was what and he could be clear. Now, of course, there are problems with it. There's always problems. It's a real place full of real people, but it is pretty functional. It's pretty good compared to a lot of human systems that I have participated in, which are generally shit shows.
Hmm. Since there's two directions we could kind of ways that we could approach this matter of the father wound as relates to establishing legitimate relational hierarchies based on wisdom and competence and
Mm.
depth of tapped inness to source intelligence.
Yeah.
Um, all of it definitely needs to be held with a sense of humor.
Uh.
Um, one is like, yeah, okay, so maybe this is the right place to start because with respect to men's work and with respect to this resonant man space, from the outset, I've been interested in what is this as a culture, like a vision for cultural transformation, not simply just as like a men's group for the sake of the typical things that a men's group does, but how does it like be a space that generates vision culturally? And one immediately comes into contact with a lot of people are afraid of even the notion of a men's group. Some people are afraid to be associated with or explore participating in one, not because they themselves aren't intrinsically drawn to it, because they perceive the threat of being pointed at, attacked, or bashed for doing so. So that's just kind of in the cultural environment. And my co-founder felt the pressure of that much more than I did. I guess I've grown up in the milieu of this, so I kind of give less fucks. But it's like yeah, I can remember years ago I had a friend from college who ended up working at Google, and just him expressing like, oh, I could never like, because I'd post about my men's group on LinkedIn. He was like, I couldn't like or comment on that because people at work, it just like, it
Oof.
would be so unacceptable. So in the building of this space, I thought part of what I need to do is like develop a kind of, this needs to be developed as an address to culture that's deeply like aware of the predominance of kind of woke or social justice disposition in most major companies and organizations, because ultimately that is where vast amounts of resources are sequestered right now. So if you want to like actually expand into big culture, you're going to come into contact with that. And if people just feel like completely uncomfortable with even touching it, then it's a non-starter. So I thought, how do I relate with this? Like, how do we convey that men being deeply attuned in relationship, deeply attuned with themselves, with their own soul's purpose, attuned with their bodies, able to be vulnerable around other men, and so on and so forth. Like all of these things are good for you, like social justice oriented person. Like you should want these things. These things are intrinsically good.
Mm.
Big
Mm.
G.
Yeah.
Um, and that I was thinking about that a lot last year, and now I'm sensing this really potent countervailing wave that I've also been tracking, which is kind of in the X space, which is kind of like a neo-masculine revival with some
Yes.
tricky edges on it, to be sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's the kind of like Christendom, Western civilization side of it, or the more like just slightly nihilistic MAGA end.
Mm,
But in the center of that, there is just this sense of like, I think, relief for a lot
mm,
of people. And
yeah.
I know a lot of guys who are, you know, very like caring fathers,
Mm,
good, you know, good, well-rounded people who are taking encouragement from what they're
mm,
seeing
mm,
in, you know, from what they perceive to be like a kind of masculine leadership that is seems to actually be doing something, and and that degree of sort of willingness to pursue your purpose and get things done independent of everybody else shitting on you or saying you can't do it, or even
or even
like,
relishing in it.
yeah, doubting it from the very start. And so there's many aspects of this which I think actually can
Hmm.
be very, very encouraging for
I agree.
men.
Yes.
But I also see like there's a need then to like, how do we kind of,
Yes.
now for me, I'm thinking less about how do I like make, how do I figure out how the value of the resonant man like comports with a kind of woke captured corporate world and culture. Then how do I like bring that forth in a way that can kind of like occupy this kind of like space that's opened now that this like counter revolutionary wave has come through and like
Mm,
washing out one predominant cultural narrative, and now there's like a little bit of a fertile no man's land, or something. There's kind of a space that seems to have opened like in the last 3 months
mm,
in the cultural field,
mm,
um, which feels opportune.
mm.
So, what do you kind of sense in relation to to that mapping? And
It seems broadly true. I notice that I don't tend to approach things strategically like that. Um, I'm just trying to be true to myself
mm,
and like my writing, right? I'm just my friend Tashin. I don't know if you know Tashin. Beautiful man. He trained at Maple with me, and he's a writer. And he's like, I just write for my own enjoyment, for my own satisfaction, and that was actually very inspiring for me. I think, yeah, culture is very hard to interact with from the strategic mind, but I think Eros, soul, like kind of knows where I belong, and if I follow it, it will position me. Um,
mm,
but I think it's true. I think what you're saying is true, and in a sense, as I reflect on what you just said, the conversation we've been having to this point, my sense is that the power shift that's happening is probably more amenable to the kind of conversation we've had than the prior, um, woke world was, because I have a sense that this emerging power at least recognizes that there is such a thing as reality and that has a structure that should be, um, not all of it, obviously. Like there's some, as you say, more nihilistic elements that are just kind of more de-evolutionary or like Joker-esque, it feels like. But there is, I think, a kind of desire to do things right or something, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to know. The other thing is it's really hard to know if anybody's being sincere. I don't know any of these people. I don't know Elon Musk. I don't know most of these people on the internet. I don't know Donald Trump. I don't know if he means what he says. Um, it's taken a lot of work for me to mean what I say. So it's really hard to. It's really hard. I know people who spend a lot of time in these waters, and they have to do a lot of work to find the signal. And I'm not really doing that work. So, right.
mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I think the spirit of your response is is the philosophy that I'm operating under, which is basically transmit the highest fidelity, most resonant signal, which is most
Mhm.
authentic to what's, you know, beautiful and true in your world, and build it and they will come. Like you can't like strategically think of like how is this gonna, I'm not trying to sort of tailor to an
Mm.
audience in that respect, but there's obviously some relationship between like what am I kind of like observing, what am I digesting is like shifting in the cultural
Mm.
infosphere kind of field, and then this like more like
Totally. Yeah.
soulful
Yeah.
artistic transmission, and how do those
Sure.
fit together?
Yeah. Which is part for me, is just like a natural part of the art making process, right? I'm taking in inputs and that's sort of like being metabolized by my psyche. And then that's being, transmuted into writing and into podcast conversations and dinner conversations here in my house. Um, yeah. Yeah. I've never been very good at the kind of political piece. Like I just have an appropriate amount of deference. I know people who are, and it's very impressive. Yeah.
Well, there's an inescapability to it as well, is part
For
of it.
now, yeah.
um, and one of the key capacities for me is to be able to, potentially hold a space of mediation.
Hmm.
Because for us, like
Yes.
within our little circle, like, in order for it to be truly permeable to what's alive in people, like some of it's going to come in and you have to kind
Yeah.
of be able to like
Agreed.
receive it and like upregulate that signal to something that somehow like feels connected with what's true, and also doesn't cause the space to collapse
Yes.
down to the level of what's
Yes.
been
Yes.
introduced, which is coming from a polarized cultural
Well
environment.
said.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
holding that between us as well. Like, just for example, like I'm holding this men's space with Matthew. He experiences the kind of coming forward, the Donald Trump wave of the last few months with a degree of dread. Like it has a
Mm.
very negative, he experiences it much more through a negative polarity.
Mm.
And mine is more sort of in the middle. Like I'm not like elated, but I'm also not alarmed that to
Mm.
the same degree. And I can also sense a degree of good. And so just like holding that,
Mm.
how do we like build a context that can hold both poles
Yes.
of a
Yeah. This
culture
is,
war between us
yeah.
inside of a kind of sacred or sacredly oriented process? And then that, like, if that process has sufficient integrity and fidelity, then periodically
Mm.
those things can come in, much like our own triggers and work between us can come in. And there's like enough of the right kind of space to digest that and keep moving forward and keep building the beautiful thing.
Well said. Yeah, I agree. This is a passion of mine as well. And um, I'm glad to hear that you're, I would say, like working on spaces that can hold polarity in a way that generates deeper intimacy. Um, because I believe those spaces, I hope, will be needed in the time to come. I hope that we have an opportunity to use our gifts in that way.
Hmm. Well, Daniel, I think it's good what you're doing.
Yeah, I love what you're doing too. It seems like we're on very similar wavelengths. It's
the
fun.
yeah, the call to a more intimate reality is yeah, it's a beautiful one. It's a beautiful one.
Mhm.
It's an important one.
Mhm.
It's very grounding. It's very peace bearing.
Mhm.
It's very empirical, actually, to have
Mhm.
more solid, intimate relationships in your field. So,
Yeah.
and I can see that you're in a position to beam out a kind of like signal wave that like saturates people with that possibility as being of core relevance to
Mm.
their lives. So,
Yeah. 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 It's been resonating really strongly. It's been wonderful to see. Yeah. Been really happy with it. And it is that this way of looking at life has profoundly transformed me. And I'm very grateful for it.
mm,
All the teachers that have helped me to clarify what is most important and most meaningful. So it's, yeah, thank you.
yeah, shout out to the teachers.
Hmm.
And also, thank you for the courage to just transmit this from a place of like emerging from what you describe as a breakdown, and to even
Mm.
like just call it that
Mm.
is a bit of a paradigm shifting event in the collective
Mm.
conversation as well.
Mm.
Um, and there's something really potent about being able to kind of like if you can be fully here in the space whilst you're in that,
Mm.
then like as you kind of come out of that wave and into like the sort of fortified, consolidated version that then
Mm.
emerges, like it's all the more powerful
Mm.
um,
Mm.
if it's been rooted from that place. Yeah,
Yeah, well, ultimately, it has to be, intimacy with reality, intimacy with life demands that we become intimate with the parts of ourselves that we've put in the shadow, that we've cut off and fractured, and um, yeah, and that was, yeah, I'm so grateful for being thoroughly brought to my knees in that way.
hallelujah. Thank you,
Hallelujah.
Daniel Thorson.
Hey,
Great to
thank you,
have you
man.
on Sense Space.
Yeah, good to be here with you.